We are talking today about measuring and reporting impact. As you just had that brief introduction, I've been an advisor for social enterprises, for grant makers, and now for venture capital on impact management. And so understanding, how do you evidence the impact that you're creating, and what are the different stages within your organization that impact is created is something that we'll be speaking about today. So first of all, we just, have to define our terminology here and understand what do we mean by impact. And how is impact assessed? How do you measure it? Maybe your business or your NGO measures it in a very different way. That's fine. We'll see how many different ways there are to assess and measure impact. And we'll also have a look at what is best to include in an impact report. If you're writing a report for a grantor, or if you're writing a report for an investor, there are some similarities, but also there are some key things you want to include depending on who your audience is. So what is impact? And I'll offer up a definition, which is that impact happens over the long term. And it is difficult to measure because it relies on lots of different types of factors. But impact ultimately is that long-term change that is caused by your work. So what you do will have a direct relationship with changing an outcome. One of the other things that's really important to keep in mind is that impact can be positive or negative, right? Not every impact is a good impact. Sometimes there are unintended impacts that are negative. And sometimes we can predict those, that we know where the trade-offs are. But sometimes unintended impacts happen quite by surprise during the process. So it's important to notice that. It's important to report that and to learn from these insights. So keep this definition in mind because it will come up later. Impact is a change in an outcome caused by an organization, and impact can be positive or negative, intended or unintended. And on this slide, I notice some of you are driving or listening in. So when you do get the slides, and those will be shared with you, I've got some websites on the slides that you can go to for further information. So this particular definition of impact is pretty widely accepted, and it was Impact Frontiers that helped me define that for you today. So you'll have that link when you look at the slides. So now that we have a definition of impact, we can look at what are the various stages that impact is created. Impact is not created overnight. It's a long-term effect. And it's a long-term effect of many different factors, ranging from the inputs, the activities, the outputs, and outcomes all have to develop before you can claim that impact is made. So let's go through these one by one. So impacts, when you think about impacts, you want to think of all the things that go into your organization, all of the things that go into your business, such as the financial resources. You can't operate your business without cash and without investment. Sometimes that cash comes in form of a grant. Sometimes that investment comes as an equity investment or debt investment. But we can get into some of the financial inputs a little bit later on. But also don't forget your human capital and your human resources that go into building your organization, go into building your business. That's an important part of the input, as well as all the material resources. If you're running a school, you've got the school building, the school grounds, you've got the other material resources. Say if you're in a farming community, where does your training take place? How do the farmers interact? Where is that engagement space that you have? So material resources is also a really important part of consideration when you talk about the impact, because it means that you're going to show how your inputs all create that impact. But then there is the next stage of impact, which is the activities, and that's That's the things you do every day. These are the actions you take every day, every week to deliver your programs. And now when we talk about outputs and outcomes, it gets sometimes a little bit tricky around the word usage. So what do we mean by outputs and outcomes, and what are the differences between them? In impact measurement and reporting, it is important to separate activities, the things you do every day, from your outputs and your outcomes. So let's go through those one by one. So the outputs are services or products that are delivered towards your outcomes. So what is the change you want to see? And how are these initial programs going to give you an indication that actually what you're doing every day, your activities are working? So for instance, you are running an after-school program for additional educational support. So the activities you do are around organizing the time of day, organizing the room, whether that's at the school or somewhere else in the community. You're going to input your financial resources to pay the tutors, to maybe provide an after-school snack. And so the activities might involve some kind of formal and informal learning. But your outputs are the kids actually doing their homework? Are they attaining better levels of understanding and comprehension? Are the outputs that the teachers are noticing a reflection of the work you're doing? So activities and outputs, maybe you can see, are very different. But then when it comes to outcomes, this is like sort of the next step after the output. So you see the kids are engaging, they come every week, or they come regularly at least, and the teachers are saying, yes, their work is improving, both in the classroom, maybe you're having good feedback from the parents as well. So lots of different stakeholders are giving you early indications that, yeah, actually this activity is working well. But what are those outcomes? Are there test results, improved graduations? Are the students going into tertiary education afterwards? Are they getting better jobs as a result of that? So some of those mid and longer term outcomes. The impact then is much longer term. It's about a year later. Are the children that were in your after school club continuing that engagement with education? Are they applying those knowledge and skills and that discipline and that sense of community to whatever they're doing, whether that's in tertiary education or in work afterwards? So that longer term positive impact comes later. So hopefully these definitions will be clear. Again, on the slides, you'll see the website from which I've taken this model from, intract.org. They have a number of other resources there. And I added a green arrow at the bottom of this slide to show you that these are sometimes back and forth. So you might do some activities, say like, oh, actually outputs and outcomes are indicating that, yes, there is impact on the horizon, but not everything is going as planned. So we're going to change the activities. Instead of it being an after-school club, we're going to do a weekend focused on computer skills. So that's a different activity. It'll have a slightly different output. Perhaps the outcomes and the impact will be similar in that the kids' educational attainment and skills development be increased. But because you have a different set of activities, the weekend computer skills training rather than an after-school club, it can be within your same organization, but then you'll have to retweak this stages of impact. The next important concept in impact measuring and reporting is looking at the metrics. So how are you going to know what to measure? So metric is a unit of time or a unit of measuring an activity. And there's a certain type of metric called SMART metrics. And these are applicable both in business as well as in NGOs. And SMART is like for the acronym that it relates. So like what you're going to measure your impact has to cover these 5 aspects. So whatever metric you use, let's say there's the metric of let's go back to the after school program or the computing skills program, that students will improve their test grades by a certain percent over an academic year. Let's say, the kids will score, 20% better on their exams within a given year. So what's nice about that particular metric is it's specific. It's very measurable. You can see, have the kids done 20% better, or maybe they've only done 15%, or maybe actually they've done 50% better. It's measurable. And it's realistic and achievable at the same time, right? It's achievable because you believe that the kinds of skills and interaction that they're getting at this computer skills program or the after school program is possible, is the kind of intervention that makes it achievable for the kids to improve their test grades. But it's also realistic because you've given this metric a time frame of a year. So it might be that maybe the next couple of tests the kids don't do that much better at, but because they're coming every week or regularly to your classes over a course of the year, they are definitely able to achieve that. So it's both achievable and realistic within the time frame. And back to the point about time, that it's timely. So when you're thinking about, well, what am I going to measure to prove my impact? Think about being SMART: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. And this concept of a SMART metric will appear in lots of different organizations and business models as well. I recommend the Social Enterprise School, and that is the website that I've given on this page as well. So you can follow up with them. They've got fantastic resources there. So impact is often spoken about in conversation, I find, as something that is assumed to be positive. It's like, we really, really want impact to be positive. But the definition of impact allows for unintended consequences. It allows for unpopular or unbeneficial impact to be made as well. So it's really important to keep in mind that just because we want impact to be great and positive, it isn't always that way. And therefore, it's important to measure that and to talk about that because there's important learnings. And let's look at option C, which is impact is a result of your activities and outputs. That's true, but it's missing that midterm phase. It's missing how are those outcomes starting to develop so that we can get indicators that actually the activities you're doing are heading in the right direction. So answer C is incomplete, and the most correct answer here is B. So well done. And we have another question coming up. Right. Question 2. There's a nonprofit organization that improves the quality of life for Nigerians by tackling water-related diseases. They provide access to clean and potable water in communities. One of their outcomes is A, improvement in quality of life of Nigerians, or B, providing access to clean and potable water in communities, or is one of their outcomes tackling water-related diseases? So the correct answer here, one of the outcomes from this case study is C, tackling water-related diseases is an outcome. So let's see why the others weren't outcomes. So answer A, oh great, here's in the poll again. So answer A, the improvement in quality of life in Nigerians, that is the long-term goal. That is the impact that can be created. So answer A is not an outcome. It's actually the impact that's looking to be created. Let's look at answer B. This social enterprise, this nonprofit organization provides access to clean and potable water in communities. So answer B is an output. It's actually an activity as well. So the activity of providing access to clean and potable water, maybe they have water pumps, maybe they have routes to purifying water, whatever their activities are that provides access to the clean water in the communities is both activity-based, but an output. The outcome of tackling water-related diseases is that mid to long-term outcome that leads to the quality of life improving. So you can't tackle water-related diseases until you have clean, potable water that the communities can access, which won't happen until you develop the activity base to get that. So hopefully this particular question, and it is tricky, will help to help clarify what the difference between outcomes and outputs and impact and what that relationship is. Right, so we have one more question this time around. So for the third question, we are talking about fish farmers in Kenya, and this particular social enterprise provides business training to the fish farmers. So what are some examples of smart metrics that they could use? So a variety of different opportunities, but think about the smart metrics we talked about. Would they want to measure the number of fish farmers registered for business training as a metric to see if their outcomes and their impact is improving? Would the social enterprise want to rather measure change of income the farmers have 1 year after the training? Or would they want to measure levels of biodiversity? And maybe for this question, there's more than one answer. Is it A or B or C, or combination of A, B, C? So some good smart metrics that we could use here are the number of fish farmers registered for the business training. That metric is smart because it is very specific. You'll end up with a number. It is very measurable because of that. It's achievable because this is why you're offering the course. You want to make sure that that it's achievable for people to not only register but actually attend. So that might be a second metric you have of the registrations, how many people actually attended. It's realistic both to have that measurement and realistic option that people who register would be interested in it and come. So you've got a little bit of an indication of the need for this business training course. And of course, it's timely because you're going to offer the training course at a particular time. You'll have registration open for a particular time. And similarly for B, right? So the change of income. So in order to measure the change of income, you would want to have your participants in the training state what their income is at the current point, and then you'll want to stay in touch with them so that you can have the ability to track that longer term change. So again, it's timely because of the timeline over a course of a year. The timeline is that it's a specific timeline, I guess, going back to the smart metrics. It's a very specific thing, looking at the change of one parameter, change of income, which is measurable. Obviously, it's self-reporting, but measurable nonetheless. And it's achievable to ask this metric. It might be that there is no change of income. It might be that there's a negative change in income, and that might be for various other reasons. But measuring the change of income is very realistic and achievable to ask for. So there are many reasons why B is a smart metric, and A is a smart metric as well. Let's look at C. Levels of biodiversity is absolutely an ESG metric that can be used. However, I would say it's not finished. So let's look at the smart parameters. Levels of biodiversity, is it specific? Well, I'm already coming up with two questions. Biodiversity of what? And is there a before and after? So is it the levels of biodiversity of, then I would maybe say, maybe the social enterprise wants to say the biodiversity of where each of the farmers fish from, or is it a national level of biodiversity, and that therefore how does their business training relate to the national? So it's not specific enough, C as a metric. It doesn't have any kind of measurability to it, like levels of biodiversity could be anything from contaminants in the water to healthy algae. So again, maybe back to the specificity. And so you can't measure what isn't specific enough. is it achievable to measure levels of biodiversity nationally? There might be national statistic that then the local area from where the fish farmers are from could tap into it. But I would also ask, how would you, as a business training social enterprise, be able to measure biodiversity? Would you work with a partner? Would you do it yourself? So this metric also isn't timely, of course. So you're talking about before and after. So it's a great foundation for an ESG metric and very important to the livelihood of your participants as fish farmers, but it's not smart enough. It's not specific, measurable, or timely. It's achievable, but it's not specific as it is written. So that's why I put C in there as sort of an unfinished smart metric that has potential, but really think about what framing. Yeah, use that smart metric when you're framing your metrics. Good, you got that. Thanks for the comment. Great. Okay, so just moving on, I've got a couple of slides here about recommendations for other impact frameworks. So if you're an NGO or a nonprofit, I recommend these 3 frameworks. They will look at smart metrics and they will look at the stages of impact, but they have slightly different parameters, I think, that are very appropriate, rigorous for NGOs and nonprofits. The next slide we'll have for social enterprises and businesses. So here on the slides, you've got Sustainable Development Goals and the website for that. If you've not worked with Sustainable Development Goals before, then please be aware, in addition of the colorful box pictures, there are specific targets and indicators with each SDG that have been developed, and those are great. If you are reporting against Sustainable Development Goals, go into those targets and indicators, map how your intervention relates to them. You may or may not be able to relate to all of the indicators and targets. You might only be able to relate to one target and have one indicator for the SDG you're going for. That is fine. It's sometimes about the quality and that specificity to evidence the impact you're making. So definitely go into the underlying targets and indicators. There is the 5 dimensions of impact, impact frontiers. Again, I mentioned them earlier, great resources. And the 5 dimensions of impact came out of a fund management firm here in the UK called Bridges Fund Management. They were the ones who, they're private equity, early impact private equity. They've been around a couple decades by now, probably have some great case studies as well. But their 5 dimensions of impact, I find a really good strategic tool for understanding what is the impact you're making, who is being impacted, how much are they being impacted, and like contribution is a term like attribution. Sometimes we talk about, well, if it weren't for your social enterprise, if it wasn't for your NGO, what would have happened to this stakeholder group? So what is your contribution to the impact? And of course, risk. There's lots of risk in any organization. There's execution risk and market risk and all kinds of risks, but there's also risk to impact. So what I like about the 5 dimensions of impact is it helps you look at, well, what is the risk analysis of impact not happening? I can do all the great activities, get early indicators that my outputs are working and the impact seems on the horizon, but actually there's this major risk factor, political risk, climate risk. What are all the risk factors that could impact my organization from making the change we want to see? And the third framework here that I recommend for NGOs and nonprofits is called theory of change. And that might be something you're familiar with. If you're not, the website here at the bottom of the screen of the slide is the New Philanthropy Capital. We're the originators of theory of change, and I've been delighted to see businesses look at theory of change. It was originally developed for the philanthropy sector and for grant makers, to help assess how their money is being utilized for the impact. And it helps organizations articulate, to describe, to find the words to say how that impact is being created. So I think that these three models are really helpful for when you're looking at impact measurement and reporting frameworks. On the next slide, I've got two suggestions. If you're a social enterprise, if you've got a business model, if you're charging for your services and outcomes, and or if you're a startup as well. So I've worked with these impact models as well. The SRRI is the social return on investment. And the organization that developed this framework is Social Value International, and that website is listed there. So what's good about SROI is it looks like an accounting. For those of you with finance and numbers at heart, you know, those of us who work with words, and those of us work with images, and there are people who love numbers. And if you love numbers and love accounting and really understand how the investment and the capital and the accounting helps make your organization fly, you will love SROI. So it really is able, it's a framework that allows you to say, for every dollar invested into your social enterprise, you know, $2.04 will be created in value, or $1.50, or $3.72. Like, it really goes to the accounting value of how impact is creating with very sound financial tools. There's another business tool framework that I find very helpful called the Impact Assessment. And B Corp, the website's there. B Corp started in the United States, and there's now several hundred B Corps in UK, where I am, and in Europe. And I think in Africa, they're just starting out. In South America, also there's some over the last few years that have been going. And so B Corps are social enterprises and businesses who sort of, what I say, walk the walk as well as talk the talk of impact. And how that tool helps businesses evidence their impact is in this BIA tool. It's a free to use tool. It will take you a few hours to navigate, but you can go to the website and sign up for a free account and then look at all their questions. So it's an online digital tool that has a lot of questions. And in that way, it helps you assess and manage your impact score, and it gives every company a score. So you get a BIA score. But in order to get the score, you have to answer something like 246 questions. It's very rigorous, and necessarily so, because you actually walk the walk. You know, it's not greenwashing. Doing a BIA is serious, and will take you a few hours just to understand the tool, and then likely several weeks to implement and assess. I highly recommend it for social enterprises and for businesses. It's a great framework. And by the way, investors look to all three of these as well. So if you're looking for investment, we'll talk about that in a minute. But if you're looking for investment, using one of these three business frameworks, I think will be very helpful when you're looking for investment. But the last framework on this slide is called ESG VC. So environmental, social governance, and VC is for venture capital. So if you are looking for venture capital investment, this is a very helpful tool. It's growing in traction here in the UK and Europe with VC investors who are trying to say, well, in my portfolio of investments, where is the impact being created? And this tool is built to help portfolio companies and social enterprises, as well as investors, understand how businesses are able, how businesses are able to measure their impact. So before we get into impact reporting, one of the other key issues that I think needs to be managed is your competitive advantage. So when looking at what to include in your impact report, and actually I think the next this is a little bit out of order. All right, so looking at your competitive advantage, right? So you want to show in your impact report, because you've got the indicators that your outputs and your outcomes are heading in the right direction, and you've got your smart metrics so that you can measure impact as it's happening. That's going to give you an ability to grow and to scale, right? So think about those organizations where they think impact is going to happen. They haven't tested it yet because maybe their metrics aren't specific enough, or maybe their metrics don't have the time element to it. So they're expecting or hoping that impact is created, but they're not really able to do it. Then they'll be down here. They're going to have some barriers to growth. On the impact side, it might be that they don't actually know what's creating the impact. Is it their activities are doing okay, but are creating some unintended impacts or unintended outcomes? Is it that their outcomes are great, but there's this major risk to impact coming down the road? So you want to separate yourself from here. And then also think about the organizations that that they may have valid outcomes. They may be a health-based charity that have all kinds of statistics about patient outcomes after immunotherapy or after whatever the intervention is, and they've got validated outcomes, but they're not really able to engage in that who, what, how. So think about that metric. So they have one set of stakeholder groups, but they're not really sure who they can they charge for that? What's their fundraising model? So they've got this great evidence, but not really the ability to grow and scale. So maybe this quadrant, if you think of yourself here, a place where you can validate, where you can evidence your outcomes because you've gone through all the stages of impact and you've made smart metrics and you've measured them over the course of the months and the years of your organization, then you will more likely find that the barriers to your growth sort of fall away. You're able to recognize them in enough time to make a risk assessment so that you can grow and scale. So see if this model might come in handy for you, but actually it's a little out of place because the next slide, this is where I wanted to start. What to include in your impact report. So these are just some ideas. It's not an exhaustive list, but if you get investment from grants or funders, you might want to think about these 3 things. And if you are looking for investment or have investment, then you may want to think about these issues here. So with both types of impact reports, you want to be clear how you've used the money. Where has the money gone? And now think about your inputs. What have you spent on your material resources? What have you spent on your human capital? And how has the cost for those activities played in? So be very clear about how you've used the money you've received to date. And in both cases, both kinds of impact reports, you definitely want to show the evidence, the early indications that your activities are heading in the right direction. And that's where looking at those outputs and outcomes and having smart metrics is really important. So you want to also talk about your governance structure, who created the impact measurement framework, who created and reviews your smart metric. Is it the board? Is it your strategic advisor? So whatever it is, there's no right or wrong answer. It's about disclosing and discussing your governance structure. That's important for both. So I think for lots of grantors and donors, you might find that everybody really likes to meet the people involved and to visit and to speak with you. If doing a visit isn't appropriate, maybe they're an international donor and they're not planning a trip for a while, make a video. These days, it's really easy to capture the sentiment and the feeling and the impact that you're creating on people's lives through a video. So sometimes it's something that's nonverbal in that way, or not always on paper. And for investors, you also, I think, can invite them in to see how their investment is taking shape. So maybe that's something to keep in mind for both. But I think one thing about asking for money. So when you're writing in your impact report to grantors and to donors, always let them know about what else could be done. And I think especially if you're evidencing with smart metrics the outcomes that are being created, and there's that sense that impact is on the horizon, going along that tune and having the donors come on board and having that longer term vision with the evidence that it's heading in that right way might be a stronger pitch than just putting in a request or proposal for doing more after school clubs or more training sessions. So that activist having a request for funding just on that activity level may not be doing as much service for you as if you're talking about all the evidence that you can see down the line. So that's a tip for when you ask for money from grantors and donors. And on the investor side, those smart metrics are going to be really, really important. And all the evidence that you have that outcomes are coming and that impact is coming is going to be important, because most investors, in fact, all investors, expect risk. So you've got your venture capital investors who expect a lot of risk, and maybe your later stage investors that are looking for more security and less risk. But every investor is going to be comfortable with risk. What they want to know is that you can manage the risk, that you know what the risks are, even if they're going to be unintended outcomes that you know will come as a trade-off. You have a way of managing that risk. And you want to show from your track record and your managerial skills that even if something unexpected happens, you can manage it, and how you would manage it, who are your advisors to help manage it. So don't be afraid about talking about the bad stuff, the negative stuff that could happen. I think when you're talking to investors, they're clever and they know that, SHIT happens. They just want to know that it can be managed well. So that's my tip for including an impact report. And also include your milestones. A 2-3 year plan needs to be aligned with your various stages of impact. So here's a way. Obviously, this is a template. Maybe your activities start in March or January, not February. It was just sort of a guidance, sort of a visual tool about how you could align your activities, how you're validating your outputs, where your focus on outcomes is going to be. Maybe you're going back, remember that green line, iterative. You're going to try some new activities to see if you can get quicker outcomes or better outcomes from different types of activities. And then how do you evidence? So make sure your action plan is always aligned with your stages of impact. And here's a checklist. And again, it's not exhaustive, but I thought it would be helpful to include all the different kinds of things. So whether you're doing an impact report for grantors and funders or for investors, so if you're a social enterprise or a charity, this checklist, non-exhaustive, will be helpful for you either way. So that's mostly what I had prepared, just in summary, to say that impact measuring and management is so important for any type of mission-driven organization or business, because you really want to be able to describe and articulate that what you're doing is happening and what is the evidence for that. And being specific using that smart metric parameter and aligning your action plans with the stages of impact is an important way to frame an impact report. And also don't forget the importance of talking about how you're going to manage stuff. So those governance structures and what will give donors and investors the comfort that you're able to manage risks, the risk to impact as well as the risk to the business. And that's linked to your good governance structures.